The story of Syria is once again slipping out of control, not with a dramatic collapse, but with something more dangerous. Quiet unraveling. Donald Trump prides himself on bold moves, headlines, handshakes, moments that feel historic. He lifted sanctions. He embraced Ahmad al-Sharaa, once linked to al-Qaeda, now presented as Syria's new leader. He shocked allies. He irritated Benjamin Netanyahu. For a moment it looked like momentum, but momentum without structure is fragile. Today, U.S. partners are fighting each other in Aleppo. Diplomatic talks between Syria and Israel are stalling, and civilians are once again paying the price. This may become Trump's first clear foreign policy failure, not because he acted, but because he didn't build what comes after action. If you care about how power actually works in the world, stay with me. Because to understand what's breaking in Syria, we first need to understand what kind of diplomacy this really is. At the center of this crisis is a contradiction. The United States is backing opposing sides. On one side, the Syrian government, newly legitimized, sanctions lifted. On the other, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, long-standing U.S. partners. Both depend on Washington. Both interpret American signals differently. The problem is not intent, it is architecture. Trump's diplomacy creates openings, but it does not sustain processes. There is no institutional depth, no enforcement mechanisms, no timelines, no dispute resolution. Agreements exist on paper, but not in practice. When negotiations stall, violence fills the vacuum. That is exactly what happened in Aleppo. The same pattern repeats with Israel. Talks are held, communiques are issued, core disputes remain untouched. This is diplomacy optimized for visibility, not durability, for moments, not systems. And Syria is a country where systems matter more than moments. To see why this approach keeps failing, we have to step back and look at how Syria arrived at this fragile point. To understand this moment, you have to understand the cycle Syria is trapped in. For years, power in Syria was centralized. Then it collapsed violently. Local actors filled the vacuum, militias, foreign patrons, parallel authorities. The SDF emerged not as an ideology, but as a mechanism, security in exchange for autonomy. The state never accepted this. It tolerated it temporarily. After December 2024, everything shifted. The old regime fell. A new government sought legitimacy fast. Sanctions relief became oxygen. Recognition became currency. But reintegration is not a slogan. It is a technical process. Armies don't merge by announcement. Territory doesn't unify by press release. Trust doesn't appear because diplomats shake hands. History is clear. When post-conflict integration is rushed, violence returns through the cracks. Syria has seen this movie before, and now with no binding framework, no shared vision of governance, the same fault lines are reopening. What came next was not surprising. It was inevitable, and it exploded in a single city. It began with a breakdown, then it became a confrontation. On the 6th of January, Syrian government forces moved into Kurdish-majority neighborhoods in Aleppo. They declared them closed military zones. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a message. More than 150,000 civilians were displaced. Families fled north, toward Afrin, toward SDF-controlled territory. A short ceasefire followed on the 8th of January. Evacuations were allowed, weapons pulled back, but the damage was done. This violence did not come from nowhere. It was the product of months of deadlock. The March 2025 agreement promised integration, but never defined how. Damascus demanded absorption. Individuals, total central command. The SDF demanded cohesion, identity, decentralization, oil fields, border crossings, institutions. All remained contested. Without constant U.S. presence, talks stalled. When mediators left the room, trust collapsed. This is the cost of diplomacy without scaffolding. If this pattern continues, Aleppo will not be the last rupture, and the next crisis is already forming beyond Syria's northern front. What you are seeing is not chaos. It is a system behaving exactly as designed. Trump's Syria policy relies on personal mediation, small teams, direct access, minimal bureaucracy that works for openings, not for implementation. There are no empowered institutions. The State Department is sidelined. Budgets are undefined. Monitoring mechanisms do not exist. So every agreement depends on presence. When U.S. envoys arrive, progress resumes. When they leave, it collapses. This creates perverse incentives. Local actors delay, test limits, reassert control on the ground. Because force speaks louder than unsigned clauses. The SDF hedges, fearing absorption without guarantees. Damascus presses, fearing fragmentation. Both are rational. Within a broken framework, headline diplomacy assumes goodwill will fill the gaps. Syria proves the opposite. In fractured states, power flows to whoever enforces reality, not promises. Without structure, agreements decay into talking points. And while attention shifts elsewhere, the next fault line begins to crack, this time along Syria's southern border. The second rupture is quieter, but more dangerous. It sits between Syria and Israel. Since December 2024, Israeli forces have moved into the UN-monitored buffer zone south of the Golan Heights. They now hold positions on the Syrian side of Mount Hermon. Air operations have intensified, targets struck across the country. At the same time, diplomacy continues. 5 rounds of talks, carefully worded statements. On the 6th of January, senior officials met in Paris. The United States mediated. The result looked like progress. A joint communication cell, U.S. oversight, intelligence sharing. But this is crisis management, not resolution. Syria demands a binding timeline for Israeli withdrawal. Israel demands security guarantees, demilitarization, protection for minority communities. These positions are not compatible without compromise, and no mechanism exists to force one. Economic proposals float in parallel. Risk reduction, stability at the margins, but economics cannot substitute for sovereignty. Without a structured settlement, this front will remain frozen until it isn't. And when it breaks, the shock will not stay regional. Now bring this closer to you, because geopolitics is never abstract for the people living inside it. If you are a Syrian family, this is not about frameworks or communiques. It is about whether your neighborhood is safe tomorrow, whether your children sleep at home or in exile, whether a ceasefire lasts the night. When talks collapse, prices rise, borders close, checkpoints multiply. Uncertainty becomes a tax on daily life. You don't choose between Damascus or the SDF. You endure the consequences of both. Displacement becomes routine. Trust becomes a luxury. And this is the hidden cost of short-term diplomacy, not measured in headlines, but in lives paused indefinitely. If this analysis helps you see Syria differently, share it, because understanding is the first step toward pressure. Pressure creates accountability, and without accountability, civilians will always absorb the impact of elite failure. But Syria's pain does not stop at its borders. The system is already transmitting shock waves outward. What happens in Syria never stays in Syria. Instability leaks. It migrates, it radicalizes. For Europe, this is not a distant crisis. It is a near-field threat. Prolonged disorder fuels irregular migration. It stretches borders. It strains politics. It also creates space for extremist networks to regenerate. Ungoverned zones do not remain empty for long. Regionally, every actor recalibrates. Turkey watches the Kurdish question closely. Iran looks for openings. The Gulf states hedge their bets. And Israel, acting unilaterally, reshapes facts on the ground. This erodes the idea of a rules-based order. Not loudly, but steadily. When agreements lack enforcement, power defaults to whoever moves first. That logic spreads. Syria becomes a case study, a signal to others that international rules are optional, that timelines are negotiable, that force precedes law. This is how regional instability becomes global precedent, and it is precisely here that the next question emerges, not about Syria's past, but about its future. Because from this moment only three paths remain. From here the future splits, not into predictions, but into choices. The first path is stabilization, slow, unremarkable, but real. It requires structure, a detailed integration plan for the SDF, timelines, monitoring, dispute resolution. It requires holding Damascus to its commitments on inclusive governance and restraining unilateral moves by Israel through enforceable security arrangements. This path is not dramatic, but it prevents relapse. The second path is managed instability. Talks continue. Crises are contained, not resolved. Ceasefires hold until they don't. Displacement slows, but never stops. This is the most likely outcome under current policy. A Syria that does not explode, but never heals. The third path is collapse. Negotiations fail, force replaces dialogue, Aleppo becomes a template. The southern front ignites. External actors escalate. This is how frozen conflicts thaw violently. History teaches one lesson clearly. Post-conflict states do not drift toward stability by default. They are pushed, or they fall backward. Syria is now balanced on that edge. What happens next depends less on intent and more on whether anyone is willing to build the system that peace requires. Syria is not failing because peace is impossible. It is failing because implementation is optional. Trump's diplomacy creates moments, but moments decay. What Syria needs is not another handshake. It needs architecture, clear rules, clear timelines, clear consequences. This is where Europe matters. The European Union understands long-term stabilization, sanctions relief tied to behavior, governance tied to funding, accountability tied to legitimacy. It has done this before, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in fractured post-war societies where patience mattered more than optics. Europe also has skin in the game. Migration, security, political stability at home. Short-termism is a luxury Europe cannot afford. If Syria becomes another Libya, another Iraq, the costs will compound for decades. This is a test of whether the rules-based international order still means anything. If power replaces process, if force replaces law, then Syria will not be the exception. It will be the precedent. If this analysis helped you see the system behind the crisis, follow for the next chapter, because Syria is not the end of this story.